Costco suing the federal government. The retail giant's asking for a full refund if the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down President Trump's tariffs. The lawsuit is similar to other suits filed by companies challenging the legality of Trump's tariffs. The Supreme Court's expected to announce its ruling early next year. ABC's Elizabeth Schulze is here with more on all that. So, Elizabeth, what's Costco hoping to gain from this lawsuit?
Diane, what Costco wants is money that it's paying for those tariffs. The wholesale retailer says that it wants a full refund for the tariffs that it's paid under this act that's been imposed by President Trump, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Okay, so a federal judge just delivered what might be the most significant legal blow yet to Trump's economic agenda by issuing an emergency order blocking the implementation of his sweeping emergency tariff orders. And this is happening because Costco, yes, the warehouse store where you buy giant containers of peanut butter and rotisserie chickens, filed a federal lawsuit arguing that Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs is completely illegal and exceeds presidential authority under the Constitution and federal law. We're talking about a judge stepping in and saying that Trump cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to slap tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, Canada, and dozens of other countries without congressional approval, which completely undermines one of Trump's signature economic policies and his entire approach to using trade policy as a weapon to pursue his political goals. The emergency order prevents U.S. Customs from enforcing these tariffs on future shipments while the legal challenge works its way through the courts, and Costco is demanding full refunds for all the duties they've already paid under these tariff orders, which could open the floodgates to thousands of other companies demanding refunds and could cost the federal government billions of dollars. Come on, when a major corporation like Costco, with armies of lawyers and massive financial resources, decides to sue the Trump administration and a federal judge immediately grants emergency relief blocking the policy, that tells you the legal arguments are strong and that Trump's tariff scheme is on extremely shaky legal ground. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. The significance of this ruling cannot be overstated because tariffs and trade policy have been absolutely central to Trump's political identity and his economic agenda going back to his first term and continuing through his campaign for re-election and now into his second term. Trump has consistently argued that tariffs are a necessary tool to protect American workers, to punish countries that he believes are taking advantage of the United States, and to force trading partners to negotiate better deals. Trump views tariffs as essentially a magic solution to all sorts of economic and political problems. China not doing what he wants on foreign policy, slap tariffs on them, Mexico not stopping immigration flows, threatened tariffs, Canada doing something he doesn't like, more tariffs. The problem is that under U.S. law, the power to impose tariffs and to regulate international commerce belongs to Congress, not to the President. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifically gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Presidents have some delegated authority from Congress to impose tariffs in specific circumstances, but those circumstances are supposed to be narrowly defined and are supposed to be subject to various procedural requirements and limitations. Trump has been trying to blow past all of those limitations by declaring economic emergencies and invoking emergency powers statutes that were never intended to be used for routine trade policy. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act that Trump is trying to use as justification for his tariffs was passed in 1977 and was designed to give presidents authority to impose economic sanctions in response to genuine national emergencies like wars, terrorist attacks, or humanitarian crises. The statute allows the president to regulate international economic transactions during a national emergency, but it explicitly says in the text that the authority granted does not include the authority to regulate or prohibit imports or exports of any goods. That exclusion was put in the law specifically to prevent presidents from using IEEPA to impose tariffs or trade restrictions without going through Congress, because lawmakers recognized that if presidents could declare economic emergencies and then unilaterally rewrite trade policy, that would give them essentially unlimited power over a huge portion of the economy. Trump and his lawyers have been arguing that even though IEEPA says it doesn't include authority to regulate imports or exports, There are other emergency power statutes that do give the president that authority, and that he can combine different statutory authorities to justify his tariff orders. But federal judges are now looking at these arguments and saying, no, you can't just piece together different statutes to create powers that Congress never intended you to have. And you can't use emergency authorities that were meant for genuine crises to implement routine trade policy that you couldn't get through Congress. The Costco lawsuit is particularly powerful because Costco is such a mainstream, non-political company that millions of Americans shop at, and that has a reputation for treating employees well and for running an efficient business. This isn't some activist organization or some company with a partisan axe to grind. This is a business that's saying, look, these tariffs are costing us and our customers enormous amounts of money. They're making it harder for us to operate, and they're illegal under federal law, so we're going to court to challenge them. Costco filed their lawsuit in the Court of International Trade, which is a specialized federal court that handles trade disputes, and they're arguing that Trump's tariff orders should be invalidated and that they should get full refunds for all the duties they've already paid on imported goods that were subject to these tariffs. The lawsuit notes that Costco has finalized entries for shipments that were subject to the tariffs, and that various statutory deadlines are approaching for challenging those entries, so they needed to file immediately to preserve their rights. The fact that a judge granted emergency relief so quickly suggests the judge found Costco's legal arguments compelling and found that there was sufficient likelihood of success on the merits to justify blocking enforcement of the tariffs while the case proceeds. What makes this legal challenge even more significant is that Costco's lawsuit is not happening in isolation. There are two lower courts that have already ruled that Trump's use of IEEPA to impose tariffs is unlawful, and those rulings are now being appealed to the Supreme Court in what could become a landmark case about the limits of presidential emergency powers. The lower court rulings found that Trump's tariff orders are unprecedented in their scope, and that they represent exactly the kind of executive overreach that IEEPA was designed to prevent. These courts have looked at the history of IEEPA and at how it's been used by previous presidents, and they've concluded that no president has ever tried to use this statute to impose sweeping tariffs on dozens of countries as a routine matter of trade policy, rather than in response to a genuine emergency. The Supreme Court challenge is going to test fundamental questions about separation of powers.
So to dive more into this lawsuit, I am joined now by Tim Meyer. He is a trade lawyer and professor of international business law at Duke University. It's good to have you on the show. Thank you.
Oh, happy to be here.
So Costco is seeking a full refund of all duties that as a result of Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs. How strong do you think their case is?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, their case is really going to turn on this a separate case that's already in front of the Supreme Court, a case called Learning Resources v. Trump. The Supreme Court heard argument in that case about a month ago.
And about whether presidents can use vaguely worded emergency statutes to assume powers that the Constitution gives to Congress. And the outcome of that case could have enormous implications, not just for trade policy, but for executive power more broadly across all sorts of policy areas. The emergency order that the judge issued blocking customs enforcement is particularly important because it has immediate practical effects on companies' ability to import goods without paying these disputed tariffs. Before the emergency order, companies importing goods from the targeted countries had to pay the tariffs when the goods entered the United States, and then they could try to get refunds later if courts ultimately ruled the tariffs were illegal. But that meant companies had to put up huge amounts of money up front and then wait potentially years for refunds, which created enormous cash flow problems and made it very difficult for smaller companies to continue operating normally. With the emergency order in place, customs can enforce the tariffs on future shipments while the legal challenge is pending, which means companies can import goods without having to pay duties they believe are illegal. This is going to provide immediate economic relief to thousands of companies and is going to prevent the tariffs from continuing to distort trade patterns and increase consumer prices while courts sort out the legal issues. The connection to all the other judicial pushback against Trump administration actions that we've been covering is really important because it shows a pattern of federal courts across the country and across different issue areas, all reaching similar conclusions that Trump is exceeding his authority and violating the law. Just like we've seen judges issuing contempt findings against Trump officials who defied deportation orders, just like we've seen Alina Habba's appointment as U.S. attorney struck down as unlawful, Just like we've seen judges blocking Pam Bondi's various controversial actions as Attorney General, now we're seeing judges blocking Trump's tariff orders as illegal uses of emergency powers. The common thread through all of these cases is that Trump claims to have sweeping authority to do whatever he wants based on creative readings of statutes or claims of inherent presidential power. And courts are pushing back and saying, no, there are limits on what you can do, and you can't just declare emergencies or invoke vague statutory language to assume powers that belong to Congress or that would violate constitutional rights. This comprehensive judicial pushback is one of the most significant checks on Trump's power and is one of the main ways the system of checks and balances is still functioning, even as other institutional constraints have weakened. The impact on consumer prices from Trump's tariff policies and from the legal uncertainty surrounding them is substantial because tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods that get passed through to consumers in the form of higher prices. When Trump imposes tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, and Canada, three of America's largest trading partners, that affects prices on everything from food to electronics to clothing to building materials. Economists have estimated that Trump's tariffs have cost American consumers and businesses tens of billions of dollars in higher prices and have contributed to inflation that's made it harder for families to afford basic necessities. The legal uncertainty about whether these tariffs are even lawful makes things worse because companies don't know whether they need to plan their supply chains and their pricing around tariffs that might be invalidated by courts, or whether they should assume the tariffs will stay in place and make long-term business decisions accordingly. This uncertainty itself has economic costs because it prevents efficient planning and investment. Let's dig into the specific legal arguments that Costco and other challengers are making about why Trump's tariff orders are unlawful, because understanding the legal reasoning helps explain why courts are finding these arguments persuasive and why Trump is facing such significant legal obstacles to his trade agenda. The central argument is that IEEPA simply doesn't authorize the president to impose tariffs, and that the text of the statute makes this clear through its explicit exclusion of authority to regulate imports or exports of goods. When Congress passed IEEPA in 1977, they were reforming an older emergency powers statute that had been used by previous presidents in ways that Congress thought were problematic, and one of the key reforms was to clarify the boundaries of what presidents could and couldn't do during declared emergencies. The exclusion of import and export regulation was deliberate and was meant to ensure that trade policy remained in congressional hands rather than becoming something presidents could unilaterally control by declaring emergencies. Trump's legal team has tried to get around this exclusion by arguing that while EPA itself doesn't authorize regulation of imports and exports, other provisions of law give the president that authority during emergencies, and that he can therefore use IEEPA in combination with these other authorities to justify tariffs. But courts are rejecting this argument because it would render the IEEPA exclusion meaningless. If presidents can just point to other statutes to do what IEEPA says they can't do, then the exclusion serves no purpose, and Congress's intent to limit presidential emergency powers over trade is completely defeated. The basic principle of statutory interpretation that courts apply is that you have to give meaning to all parts of a statute, and you can't read statutes in ways that make specific provisions irrelevant or meaningless. When Congress specifically said in IEEPA that the president can't use this statute to regulate imports or exports, courts are saying that means the president can't use IEEPA to impose tariffs, period, regardless of what other statutes might say. The lower court rulings that found Trump's tariffs unlawful have gone into extensive detail about the history of IEEPA and how it's been used by previous presidents, and they found that no prior president has tried to use this statute in the way Trump is using it. Previous uses of IEEPA have been for things like freezing assets of foreign governments during conflicts, imposing sanctions on individuals involved in terrorism or human rights abuses, and blocking financial transactions with countries that pose genuine security threats. Those uses are all clearly within the scope of what IEEPA was designed to address: genuine emergencies where quick presidential action is needed and where the specific economic measures being taken are targeted at addressing the emergency. Trump's tariffs don't fit that pattern at all. He's declaring economic emergencies based on trade deficits or based on alleged unfair trade practices, and then he's imposing broad tariffs on all imports from certain countries rather than targeting specific bad actors or specific problematic transactions. Courts are saying this looks much more like routine trade policy that should go through Congress rather than emergency action that requires immediate presidential intervention. The Supreme Court challenge that's pending is going to be absolutely critical because it could establish binding precedent about the scope of presidential emergency powers that would apply not just to tariffs, but to all sorts of other contexts where presidents might try to invoke emergency authorities. If the Supreme Court rules that Trump can't use IEEPA to impose tariffs because the statute doesn't authorize that, then that limits what future presidents can do with this statute and reinforces congressional authority over trade policy. But if the Supreme Court rules that Trump can use IEEPA in combination with other statutory authorities to impose tariffs, then that dramatically expands presidential power and could enable future presidents to implement all sorts of economic policies unilaterally by declaring emergencies. The stakes are enormous because this isn't just about whether particular tariffs on particular countries are legal. It's about the fundamental constitutional question of whether we have separation of powers where Congress makes laws and presidents execute them, or whether presidents can effectively make law through creative invocation of emergency powers. The practical impact of the emergency order blocking customs enforcement is going to be felt immediately by companies across the country that import goods from the affected countries. Before this order, companies were having to factor tariff costs into all their pricing and business decisions, which was making American goods more expensive and less competitive, and was disrupting supply chains that had been built up over decades. With the emergency order in place, companies that import goods covered by Trump's tariff orders don't have to pay those duties on new shipments while the legal challenge is pending. This is going to provide immediate cost savings that could be passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices, and it's going to reduce the economic distortions that tariffs create where companies make inefficient business decisions just to avoid tariff costs. The relief is temporary because if Trump ultimately wins the legal challenges, the tariffs could be reinstated and companies might even have to pay retroactive duties. But at least for now, companies get breathing room and don't have to put up money for tariffs that might be ruled illegal. The refund cascade that could result if courts ultimately rule Trump's tariffs were unlawful is potentially massive in scale because we're talking about duties that have been collected on billions of dollars worth of imports over an extended period. Costco is seeking full refunds of all tariffs they've paid under Trump's emergency orders. And if they're successful, thousands of other companies are going to file similar refund claims, demanding back all the money they paid in duties that courts say were illegal. The federal government could be facing a liability of tens of billions of dollars in tariff refunds, which would be a huge financial hit and would complicate budget planning. From a legal and equitable perspective, if the government collected money through unlawful tariffs, companies should get that money back because the government had no legal authority to collect it in the first place. But from a practical fiscal management perspective, having to pay back tens of billions of dollars in tariffs all at once would create significant budgetary challenges. The connection to House GOP fractures and the Capitol fire chaos is that Trump's tariff policies have always been controversial even within the Republican Party, with free trade conservatives and business-oriented Republicans viewing tariffs as taxes that hurt American consumers and businesses. The legal challenges to Trump's tariffs are exposing these intra-party tensions because Republicans have to decide whether to defend Trump's expansive use of presidential power, even when it's being used to implement trade policies many of them don't agree with, or whether to side with courts and businesses in saying Trump has gone too far. Speaker Mike Johnson is already dealing with impossible pressures from different factions of his conference on issues like government funding and border security, and now he's got to navigate the tariff issue where the MAGA base loves Trump's protectionist trade policies, but business Republicans and free market conservatives hate them. The Capitol fire and the broader chaos in Washington are making it even harder for House Republicans to present a unified message or to accomplish anything legislatively because they're constantly dealing with crises and internal conflicts. The precedent implications of allowing Trump to use emergency powers to impose tariffs are deeply troubling to legal scholars and to anyone who cares about maintaining constitutional limits on presidential power. If presidents can declare economic emergencies based on trade deficits or based on vague claims about unfair trade practices, and then use those declared emergencies to impose tariffs without congressional approval, what's to stop presidents from using the same logic to implement all sorts of other economic policies? Could a president declare a climate emergency and then use emergency powers to impose carbon taxes or to ban fossil fuel imports? Could a president declare a healthcare emergency and use emergency powers to set drug prices or to commandeer medical supplies? The possibilities for abuse are endless once you accept the premise that presidents can use broadly worded emergency statutes to do things that would normally require congressional authorization. Courts are recognizing this slippery slope problem and are trying to draw clear lines about what presidents can and can't do under emergency authorities. So what does this emergency judicial order blocking Trump's tariffs actually mean for his presidency, for the economy, for consumers, and for the broader political landscape heading into the midterms? Well, first and most obviously, this is a major blow to Trump's economic agenda and to his ability to use trade policy as a tool for pursuing his political goals. Tariffs have been one of Trump's signature policies since his first campaign, and he's consistently argued that his tough approach on trade is protecting American workers and making America more competitive. But if courts are ruling that his tariff orders are illegal and blocking their enforcement, then Trump can't deliver on those promises, and the economic benefits he's claimed would result from tariffs won't materialize. This is going to be politically damaging because Trump has staked so much of his economic credibility on tariffs working and on his ability to use the threat of tariffs to force other countries to negotiate better deals. When judges are saying you don't have the authority to impose these tariffs, that completely undercuts Trump's negotiating leverage and his entire approach to trade policy. The consumer price implications of having tariffs blocked are potentially significant because tariffs do increase prices. So if tariffs are no longer being collected, that should reduce pressure on consumer prices and could provide some relief for families dealing with inflation. The relationship between tariffs and inflation is complex because other factors also affect prices, but economists generally agree that tariffs function as taxes on imported goods that get passed through to consumers. If Trump's tariffs are blocked, and companies don't have to pay those duties, then at least some of that savings should show up in lower prices for consumers on everything from groceries to electronics to clothing. This could actually help Trump politically if it reduces inflation and makes people feel like the economy is improving, but it also completely contradicts Trump's argument that tariffs are necessary and beneficial, so it creates a messaging problem where Trump has to explain why blocking his tariffs is good for the economy. The refund cascade that could result from Costco's lawsuit and similar challenges has the potential to be absolutely massive and could create significant fiscal problems for the federal government. If courts ultimately rule that Trump's tariffs were unlawful and that companies are entitled to refunds of all duties paid under those orders, we're talking about potentially tens of billions of dollars in refund claims that would need to be processed and paid out. The administrative burden of handling all those refund requests would be enormous, and the fiscal impact of actually paying out the refunds would hit the federal budget hard. From companies' perspectives, getting these refunds would provide a huge influx of cash that could be used for investment, for hiring, or for returning value to shareholders. But the complexity of calculating exactly who paid what and who's entitled to refunds, especially when you're dealing with multiple tariff orders imposed at different times on different products, is going to create administrative nightmares. The signal that this judicial ruling sends about limits on Trump's power is hugely important because it shows that courts are willing to aggressively check executive overreach even when it involves core policy priorities of a sitting president. Trump has tested the boundaries of presidential power more aggressively than probably any president in modern history, and he's done so across multiple policy domains, from immigration to trade to law enforcement to emergency powers. Courts have been the most consistent and effective check on Trump's overreach, repeatedly ruling that his actions exceed his authority or violate constitutional rights. The tariff ruling is another example of courts saying there are limits on what presidents can do, even during declared emergencies, and that presidents can't use creative statutory interpretations to assume powers that belong to Congress. This is exactly how separation of powers is supposed to work. When one branch exceeds its authority, another branch steps in to enforce constitutional limits. The weakening of MAGA economic boasts before midterms that results from Trump's tariff policies being blocked is going to be politically significant because Republicans were planning to run on economic issues and on Trump's record of tough trade policies. If Trump's signature trade policies are being struck down by courts as illegal, and if companies are getting refunds for tariffs they were forced to pay, that undermines the entire narrative about Trump being a strong economic leader who got tough results on trade. Democrats are going to hammer this issue relentlessly, arguing that Trump's approach to trade has been chaotic and illegal and has hurt American consumers and businesses rather than helping them. The fact that major mainstream companies like Costco are suing the Trump administration over tariffs gives Democrats credibility on this issue because they can point to actual businesses saying Trump's policies are harmful and illegal, rather than just making partisan political arguments. The amplification of scandal pileup that results from adding tariff litigation to all the other legal and political problems Trump is facing is significant because it creates this overwhelming sense that Trump's presidency is under siege from multiple directions. We've got the classified documents investigation with prosecutors demanding Trump's testimony. We've got contempt proceedings against Trump officials who defied court orders. We've got DOJ mass resignations over corrupt prosecutions. We've got FBI lawsuits against Kash Patel. We've got Pam Bondi's various unlawful actions as Attorney General. We've got Trump's courtroom meltdowns and threats against lawmakers. We've got House GOP chaos and calls for Trump to resign. We've got the Capitol fire and the symbolic chaos it represented. And now we've got major corporations suing over unlawful tariffs and judges blocking Trump's trade policies. Each individual problem might be manageable on its own, but the cumulative weight of all these crises happening simultaneously is creating a narrative of a presidency in complete disarray that can't accomplish anything without being blocked by courts or undermined by internal chaos. The bottom line is this: the federal judge's emergency order blocking Trump's tariff implementation following Costco's lawsuit represents a major legal and political defeat for Trump that undermines one of his signature economic policies and exposes him to potentially billions of dollars in refund liabilities while signaling clear judicial limits on his abuse of emergency powers. The ruling shows that Trump's attempt to use IEEPA to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval is being rejected by courts as an unlawful expansion of presidential power that violates both the text of the statute and the constitutional separation of powers. The immediate practical effect is that companies can import goods without paying disputed tariffs while the legal challenges proceed, which provides economic relief and reduces consumer prices. The longer-term implications include a potential Supreme Court ruling that establishes binding precedent limiting presidential emergency powers, a massive refund cascade if Trump's tariffs are ultimately ruled unlawful, and significant political damage heading into midterms as Trump's economic agenda is blocked by courts and as his credibility on trade issues is undermined. Combined with all the other legal and political crises facing Trump's administration, the tariff ruling contributes to an overwhelming sense that Trump is losing control and that judicial checks on his power are increasingly effective at constraining his most aggressive impulses.